Welcome, everybody. This is the lecture on presidential power, the post 9/11 president. But before we begin, here are the set of review questions from the U.S. Judiciary lecture. Now, if you've already completed these review questions, feel free just to move forward to the beginning of the lecture. But if you haven't, this is assigned. Please make sure that you complete these questions before I return. And so there are three simple, again, very straightforward questions here for you to answer. Why did Hamilton consider the judicial branch the weakest branch in our system of government? List three reasons that I gave out in lecture, and you could always reference back Federalist number 78. Number two, what is the difference between original versus appellate jurisdiction? Be able to distinguish both and define them. And last but not least, the third question, what is judicial review? And so with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Presidential Power, the post 9/11 President Lecture. I really regret not being with you in class to talk about this really important issue on defending our national security while again preserving our freedoms here, because this is one of my most favorite lectures in the class, if not the most, my most favorite. So with that said, let me just start off with a story, and it goes back again to 9/11. 9/11, September 11th, 2001, clearly was a turning point in our country's history. It really brought the reality of terrorism at home. Yes, we were attacked on December 7th, 1941 by the Imperial Army of Japan, the day of infamy, but the magnitude of 9/11 was different. 9/11 was different because terrorists attacked and killed civilians. The Japanese Imperial Army attacked a military installation. And so clearly this was a new form of terrorism that, for those of us who lived through it, including yours truly, really changed how we view the world. The perpetrators were not sovereign. They didn't come from a sovereign nation, but they were, in fact, a global terrorist network who were not in any way sponsored by a national government. And so that tragic day, as we know, more than 3,000 of our fellow citizens died at the World Trade Centers in Somerset, Pennsylvania, with United Flight 93 going down, and in the Pentagon. And interestingly enough, this is somewhat of a tangent, but some of you may know that United Flight 93 that left Newark, New Jersey, was bound, in fact, to San Francisco. If it had reached its destination, it would have landed here in Northern California. So there is a Northern California connection, everybody, to 9/11. Not a lot of people remember that. Flight 93 was the one that crashed in Somerset, Pennsylvania, when the passengers managed to subdue the hijackers. But tragically, the plane crashed. And in a way, they were heroes because it never reached the intended target. And experts say that the target would have either been Capitol Hill or the White House. So really, the following days after 9/11, we looked to the president and how we would combat this new threat, which became known to be as Al-Qaeda, or the base. And in times of crisis and war, it is the president who assumes the role of framing the response. And so following the attacks, the president spoke to the nation and declared his policy on the war against terrorism. And of course, the president back then was former President George W. Bush. And his objectives were, in fact, to counteract terrorist threats, prevent terrorist attacks from happening again. And so in this particular lecture, we're going to look at the post 9/11 presidencies now. We're going to look at the policies that President George W. Bush implemented, followed by President Obama, and really a continuation of that with President Trump's policies of today. And so we'll be examining a few of the I think, most important policies that were implemented to combat the war against terror. And really, I want us to frame this lecture through looking through the lens of the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 2. And I'll present to you again the policies in the next slide. So let's go ahead and turn to those specific policies. It seems like every time I teach this class, and as time passes, I expand more on this particular list. So here were the policies that were passed by the three administrations that I talked about. We're going to look at in this lecture the following issues, the following policies. First, we'll look at presidential signing statements, followed by the term, or the legal term to be more precise, enemy combatants, followed by the terrorist surveillance programs that have been used to track, again, these terrorists or enemies of the state. We'll look at the program of extraordinary renditions, followed by the drone program. These are the unmanned drones that hit targets, that allows us to eliminate enemies of the state. And then we'll look at the executive order limiting immigration by President Trump as well, which you'll find out has a national security component to it. At least that's how the government frames this issue. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, I want you to focus on these policies looking through the lens of the Constitution, specifically Article 2, Section 2, and the President's inherent powers, which you should know at this point of class. And so with that said, I'm going to present to you both the legal and illegal arguments regarding these policies. Understand all of these policies come directly from the President of the United States. And so I'm going to, in a way, be presenting both, as I mentioned, the legal and illegal arguments regarding these specific policies as I move forward in the lecture. In one respect, if you believe that these policies are within the President's Article 2, Section 2 powers, part of his inherent powers, then we would deem this policy as constitutional, legal, right? If you deem this policy to have overstepped the President's powers under Article 2, Section 2 in his inherent powers, then you would argue that he has overstepped his powers, and therefore his actions would be illegal in this case, or unconstitutional. So understand that we will be looking at each and every one of these policies through those two lenses, and I'm going to be as objective as I can to provide both the legal and illegal arguments, or the constitutional and unconstitutional arguments respectively for these policies. I'm not going to tell you where I side. I think it's incumbent upon you to discuss and debate these policies amongst yourselves. This is important, especially from the context that these policies have to do with our national security and keeping all of us safe, and again preventing another 9/11 from happening. And so with that said, let's look at the first policy, presidential signing statements. So what is a presidential signing statement? If you recall from the legislative process presentation I provided you, I introduced you to this term, but I never fully elaborated on it. The president, after he signs a bill into law, hint hint, can issue what's called a presidential signing statement. And so what does this specific tool do? It's a written pronouncement issued by the President of the United States upon the signing of a bill into law. And I want you to understand that sometimes when Congress crafts a bill and it gets to the President, it may be vague as to how that new bill should be implemented. And understand that this happens from time to time. Remember, Congress makes the laws. It is the role and the responsibility of the executive branch, in this case the president, to implement and execute those laws. But like I said, sometimes when the bill reaches the president's desk, it may not be clear as to how the president should implement the following bill. And so when that happens, the president can sign that bill into law and assign with it, almost as if it's an addendum, right, to the new law that he signed, as to how he intends to implement the new law, right? So understand that a presidential signing statement really has two purposes. One, if you look at the PowerPoint, it intends to clarify how that law is to be implemented, right? The president gets the discretion here to clarify how that law is to be implemented. And if you think about it, and if you think about that deeply, that is essentially what the president's role is, right, under the U.S. Constitution. He also has the ability here concurrently to define those vague terms in that specific bill, which he's now signed into law, to guide, again, the executive agencies, right, these executive departments that he's over, to guide them, to help them through its implementation. Okay, so understand that that is a presidential signing statement. Now, I want us to briefly take a step back and compare and contrast the differences and really the similarities between the line item veto versus the presidential signing statement. Now, hint, hint on this, pay attention, because this is important. I want you to be able to distinguish these two, because it will clarify, again, the discussion and the debate, whether or not presidential signing statements in your mind is legal or illegal. A line item veto, folks, gives the president the ability to take a bill that has been sent to him by Congress, okay, from Congress to his desk, and it allows him to take his pen, and I believe it's a red pen, to essentially cross out sections of the bill that he doesn't agree with. After he goes through the entire bill, removes clauses and parts of the bill that he doesn't like, then he signs the bill into law. That is called a line item veto. Okay? I want you to understand that the line item veto, hint, hint, was deemed unconstitutional. And if I were in class, I would, in a way, ask you that rhetorical question. Why do you believe that the line item veto was deemed by the courts unconstitutional in this specific Supreme Court case, Clinton versus the City of New York, back in 1998? Well, if you ponder that question, I think it's pretty apparent, which the court agreed in this case, that the line item veto clearly is a violation of separation of powers, right? Because, again, it is not the president's prerogative to make laws, but rather Congress. And for the president to be able to remove clauses that he doesn't agree with in a specific bill would be, right, as the court interpreted, usurping the powers of Congress to make and craft the law. And so, in this case, understand that the President of the United States does not have the ability to use the line item veto. Just as an aside, governors from states can. Okay, there's been no legal standing challenge to the use of line item veto for state governors. So state governors still have the ability to do this in their own states, which they predominantly use, particularly when it comes to budget items. But at the federal level, okay, the U.S. president in this case does not have the ability to use the line item veto. So given that, you now know the differences between a line item veto and a presidential signing statement. And you'll find out that the controversy really lies, in how the president uses the presidential signing statement. If he uses the presidential signing statement similarly to a line item veto, then we could argue that the line item veto, or in this case the presidential signing statement, check that, would be deemed unconstitutional. Or do we believe the flip side of the coin, where the presidential signing statement falls within his powers under Article 2, Section 2, and therefore his actions are constitutional? So let me now present you the legal arguments as to why presidential signing statements are constitutional, or at least interpreted to be constitutional. So the legal argument for presidential signing statements, folks, is that if you look at the U.S. Constitution, there is nothing there that explicitly prohibits its use. And I mentioned that to you in the presidency lecture, that if you look at Article 2, there is really nothing, right? The framers were silent as to any limitations of the powers of the president. They decided not to give any limitations to the president, given his important role in protecting all of us and protecting national security. If you want to protect a country, you don't give the president any limitations to his power. Which again, understandably, I can see why the framers had done that during the Constitutional Convention, but now 230 some odd years after, right, looking 2020 hindsight, we now see that there are some ramifications and repercussions to not doing this, right, to not curtailing the power of the president. One being, again, there's nothing there that says that he can't, pass and use this policy-making tool. Another reason, if you critically think about this, is that it falls within his powers, right? It falls within the president's powers to issue signing statements. It allows him to do his job, right? If you look at Article 1, Section 7, the presentment clause, you couple that with Article 2, Section 3, that says that the president shall, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It's not a question. There's no question that it's part of his job description, right? To execute and implement the laws, and really the presidential signing statement allows him really to fulfill his job under the U.S. Constitution. So that's the basis of his legal argument. Now, if you look at the Bush administration's argument, and really any administration, they're going to point to the following reasons, and you'll see this as a common theme from now until really the end of the lecture. First and foremost, they're going to argue that the reason why they can issue a presidential signing statement, as you'll find out all of the other policies that I'll cover in this lecture, is that they justify it through, again, the argument of keeping us safe, through national security. Hint, hint, hint. You'll definitely see this run through the entire course of this lecture. Okay? Presidents can do this, okay, because it's the president's role, his responsibility to keep us safe. And then, followed by the national security argument, is what's called the unitary executive. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember the Bush administration and the controversies surrounding his policies, there were a lot of critics against the president because they believed that he had overstepped his powers under Article 2, Section 2, and that his policies here would undermine civil liberties of people and civil rights of people. Well, President Bush pushed back on that argument, and what he did, folks, was he asserted his own powers under the U.S. Constitution, which many scholars have now called the unitary executive. This is actually very complex legally, so I'm going to just really give you the gist of this argument, and it's essentially this. President Bush argued that the framers gave him powers under the U.S. Constitution and gave Congress also powers under the U.S. Constitution. And for anyone to prevent the president from doing what he needs to do in fulfilling his roles and responsibilities, his jobs under the U.S. Constitution, would also be unconstitutional. Does that make sense? Understand the logic there. He's flipped the argument around to essentially advocate, the executive branch's interest, right? And so he used this against his critics, that if his critics are preventing him from doing what he needs to do to protect us for the purposes of national security, then clearly their actions would also be deemed unconstitutional. That is really the gist of the unitary executive that allows the president in this case to take upon action, that would protect all of us. There's also historical precedent to this. Every president since the 5th president of the United States, James Monroe, had used signing statements. Modern presidents have used it. Past presidents have used it. We have had President Bush use signing statements. So is President Obama. And I'm actually quite unsure at this point about President Trump. But all other presidents have in fact used some variation of the presidential signing statement, like I said, stemming all the way back to really the early days of the Republic. So these are the legal arguments. These are the legal basis for presidential signing statements, you guys. National security, unitary executive, historical precedent, and clearly it is not prevented, not prohibited in this case, by the U.S. Constitution. So what then is the big deal? So I want to take a step back before I talk about the illegal argument here. I want to share with you the story of Abu Ghraib prison. Abu Ghraib prison, or Abu Ghraib's prison, depending on your pronunciation, was a prison in Iraq near Baghdad. When we invaded Baghdad and had control of that country, when we occupied that country, we took over Abu Ghraib prison, and we of course jailed our enemies there, enemies of the United States, suspected terrorists as well. We locked them up, and unfortunately the U.S. military personnel who ran the prison, there was a controversy that exposed the actions that they did in that prison, which were horrible. They treated the detainees very, very poorly. Some of them were abused. Some of them, again, pardon the description here, were urinated upon. Some of them were, you could argue, experienced torture. And what had happened was that this expose, this scandal, was revealed and leaked to the press. And all you have to do is Google Abu Ghraib prison to see really these photographs, and it's really disheartening that our military personnel, or at least a few of our military personnel, would treat these detainees in such a way. But it forced Congress to act, and because of the Abu Ghraib scandal, Congress passed a specific law. And in that law, which was, by the way, this is important for you to know, was sponsored by Senator John McCain. And in this law, it says that we, the United States, do not torture. And in fact, John McCain was the senator who sponsored the anti-torture amendment in this specific law to address this controversy. And it only made sense, right, that Senator McCain would sponsor this amendment, given that he himself was a POW. And if you don't know the story of John McCain, I have great respect for the senator. John McCain, he himself was a POW, was a prisoner of war. During the Vietnam War, his plane was shot down, and he was taken prisoner by the Viet Cong. And what you may not know was that John McCain's father was the admiral of the Pacific Fleet at the time, and so when the Viet Cong realized that they had the son of the admiral as a prisoner, they opened up negotiations for a prisoner exchange. Well, long story short, John McCain refused to be traded. He basically said, no, we do not negotiate with terrorists like you, or the enemy like you. And so because of that, John McCain spent an additional, I believe it was 4 years in the brutal hands of the Viet Cong, where he was tortured. And if you've ever seen pictures of John McCain when he first ran for Congress, he was rail thin, and he couldn't really lift his hands above his shoulder. All of this was because of the treatment that he faced, that he experienced under the brutal hands of the Viet Cong. So I digress. He moves this bill forward. It, in fact, receives bipartisan support in Congress. It was passed. It goes to President Bush. President Bush signs it into law. Okay. Again, what's the purpose of the bill that has been signed into law? It states that America does not torture. And after he signs it into law, President Bush immediately assigns a presidential signing statement, or attaches a presidential signing statement to the law that basically said the following. Now pay close attention here. This is very important. He says that yes, we the United States do not torture, but as the President of the United States, as the executive, he gets to decide what torture is and what torture isn't. Think about that. Think about what he just said. Because of this, there was outrage that began with the American Bar Association. As you can see, this quote from July 2006 that says, signing statements to modify the meaning of duly enacted law are contrary to the rule of law and our constitutional system of separation of powers. So what's the ABA really getting into? They believe, right, that President Bush's signing statement, this particular signing statement, where he says, yes, we may not as a country torture, but as president he can determine what torture is and what torture isn't. They clearly believe that this was an overstep, right? That this interpretation of the law, in this case, undermines Congress to make the law and subverts the original intention of the bill, which was, again, that the United States does not torture. And if you continue along with this logic, clearly this would violate checks and balances. This would violate separation of powers, and as such, it should be deemed unconstitutional. Or do you believe that it is within the president's ability here, that at the end of the day he was just clarifying this law, given the fact that he has the ability to protect us and to use any means necessary to protect the country? Okay? And so it becomes very, very controversial, folks. And again, I don't have a right or wrong answer here, but this is the type of very, very important legal questions, constitutional questions that are still being bandied about even today. Do you believe that presidential signing statements are constitutional or unconstitutional? Are they legal? Are they illegal? So with that said, I'm going to have you guys ponder that, and I'll move on into the next policy in the next slide. So the next policy we're going to look at is this term, this legal term called enemy combatants. Now, we've already talked about the AUMF in the class. You recall that Congress passed this particular AUMF, Authorization to Use of Military Force, this resolution against Iraq. This was back in October 2002. And in this particular AUMF, the president issues a presidential military order. Now, I don't want to confuse you here. This is very similar to an executive order that the president uses, called, in this case, the, quote, detention, treatment, and trial of certain non-citizens in the war against terrorism. And so he issues out this executive order, to expand upon his powers as delineated under the AUMF, and what he claimed and what he asserted in this presidential military order is that anyone that we detain, right? Anyone that we capture or anyone who we believe to be affiliated with terrorist organizations, whether it be Al-Qaeda, in this case today ISIS, and whatnot, we would call these individuals legally enemy combatants. And you'll find out that that term, enemy combatants, as I mentioned already, is a legal term. A legal term to really prevent detainees from receiving any of the rights that they could be given. Okay, and if you look at it from the perspective of the president, clearly you do not want to give any of these terrorists, or at least suspected terrorists, who we believe to be enemies of the United States. We don't want to give these folks any legal rights at all, right, to defend themselves in a court of law. What we want to do is we want to detain them. We want to make sure we get as much information from them, again, to prevent another 9/11 style attack. Okay, so there's the backdrop. Let's look at the illegal and legal arguments here, starting with the legal. So the question then becomes, was it legal for the Bush administration to call these detainees enemy combatants? And the administration, again, is going to basically point to these three things: that it is part of the president's inherent powers. And because it's part of his inherent powers, clearly by using an executive order, it is legal. He has the ability to use this policy-making tool to assert that these detainees who we suspect to be enemies of the states should be deemed enemy combatants. We know that these were also powers that were delegated to him by Congress under the AUMF as well. So all of these, right, okay, compound compound to the legal rationale as to why Congress, in this case, to provide the president in this case, right, the ability to do this, given the fact that he was given delegation and authority by Congress. So why call them enemy combatants? As I've already mentioned to you, we don't want to give them any rights. And so here's we get into the legal technicalities of this, you guys. We've signed, hint hint, an international treaty called the Geneva Conventions. And the Geneva Conventions essentially lays out the ground rules for war. If you've ever watched a war movie, really post World War II, you're familiar with these laws, right? For those of you who've served in the military, first and foremost, thank you for your service. But as you recall, if you're ever taken prisoner by a country who's a signatory of the Geneva Conventions, you do have some form of legal rights. You disclose your name, you disclose your rank, maybe your serial number. All of those fall within the Geneva Conventions. Well, it also, under the Geneva Conventions, folks, lists down who is a prisoner of war, okay, who is a POW, and who is not a POW. And I want you guys to concentrate on this, hint, hint, because this is two very important terms that you'll need to know. If they are considered a POW under the Geneva Conventions, they are going to be viewed as lawful combatants. If they do not meet the criteria of being POWs under the Geneva Conventions, then they would be deemed unlawful combatants. So it's not on the PowerPoint, so you'll need to write this down, so pay close attention. So what are the criteria under the Geneva Conventions to be given the status of POW? There are three of them. The first is that you have to wear a uniform, right? A military uniform, fatigues, and whatnot. Okay, that is the first requirement according to the Geneva Convention. On that uniform, typically patched on the shoulder side, here is the second requirement, okay? That of a flag of a nation state that sponsors you, okay, that you are, in a way, a state-sponsored actor. Okay, so that's criteria number 2. Criteria number 3 says that you have to be openly bearing your weapons publicly, which means that if you are walking around, everyone can see your rifle, whatever it is you're holding, your semi-automatic weapon. Okay, and the Bush administration argued that if you apply these criteria to members of Al-Qaeda, they don't meet it. Think about it. Do members of Al-Qaeda wear a uniform? Sometimes, but really they don't. And of course, if they're not wearing a uniform, clearly they do not affiliate with any state government, right? National state government. Do they openly bear their weapons publicly? Well, sometimes. Okay? And so since they are not state-sponsored actors, but rather folks non-state actors, the Bush administration argued that they should not be afforded POW status, and as such should not be given the same rights that would be afforded to POWs, and therefore should be deemed as unlawful combatants. And so unlawful combatants, you guys, is the same as enemy combatants. Okay, I just want you guys to be clear about that. And so given this rationale, legal argument, we've taken people like the one pictured right below here, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's alleged to be the mastermind of 9/11. We would take these individuals, not give them any rights at all, and send them to Guantanamo Bay naval base in Cuba. Now, some of you folks may be scratching your heads and asking yourselves, we have a U.S. naval base in Cuba? How is that possible? We, in fact, built this base right before the rise of Fidel Castro, before Castro established a communist regime in Cuba. In fact, we built a naval base there during the Spanish-American War. I don't want to get into the history, just know that we're there. Once we built our base there, we're not going to move our base. And so that's why we have a base in Cuba. Okay? And so we send them to Cuba for a reason, you guys. Again, this is a very important point that you need to understand. Why then would it be prudent for us to send these detainees to a naval base in Cuba? And why wouldn't we send them here to the United States, on the U.S. mainland, for example? Well, the answer, I think, is pretty simple. And some of you may, in fact, know this answer. But if you bring these detainees here, right, to the United States, you, by virtue of the law, must afford these detainees legal rights. And so the Bush administration, and in a way subsequent administrations, have brought these folks to Guantanamo Bay as a way here to basically prevent them from receiving any rights, from limiting their rights. Right? There is clearly a political motive here to send them to Gitmo. And in a way, it puts them in legal limbo here, whether or not they should be afforded rights or not be afforded rights. But understand that following 9/11 and after we conducted operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and interestingly enough, we're still in Afghanistan, these folks were sent to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Okay? And because they were deemed as enemy combatants, clearly they were not given due process. They were not given any legal rights. And clearly their right to habeas corpus were also disenfranchised. Okay? And again, the president says we're able to do this for the basis of maintaining national security and protecting us from the enemy. So what are the illegal arguments here, you guys? Well, it violates civil liberties. Okay? We haven't talked about civil liberties yet, but clearly this violates the due process rights of these detainees. Clearly we violated their habeas corpus rights. And what you'll see, folks, are a series of Supreme Court cases that really challenged this question of whether or not the administration could call them enemy combatants. And hint, hint on these. I want you guys to pay close attention to these specific Supreme Court cases, in that it's a very good example of checks and balances playing out. And you'll see how this works here. So let me start off with the first case called Rasul versus Bush, which was back in 2004. Now, Rasul was an alleged member of Al-Qaeda and sues President Bush. Okay, he was a detainee held in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And I might as well take a step back here and provide you a caveat. How then were these detainees able to challenge their cases in the courts, particularly in our courts, right, U.S. courts? Well, their loved ones found out that they were under U.S. custody, and their loved ones hired U.S. attorneys to speak on their behalf. And so they filed lawsuits against the government, in this case, President Bush, and that's how ultimately we got this specific case to go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so under Rasul versus Bush, Rasul claims and argues that he is in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And since Guantanamo Bay, Cuba is a U.S. naval base, and I think most of you will know where I'm going with this, if it's a U.S. naval base, it is also deemed being on U.S. soil. And if he is on U.S. soil, as he claims, then he should be afforded his legal rights, right? His natural rights, his due process rights. And so it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor, folks, of Mr. Rasul. The Supreme Court said, Mr. Rasul, you're absolutely right. You are in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is a U.S. naval base. Since it is a U.S. naval base, you are technically on U.S. soil, and as such, you must be afforded your due process rights. And as a result, since the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Rasul, then the administration has to respond to that, right? So the administration, okay, in this case, the Bush administration, responded by creating military tribunals. Military courts, okay? You have to give Rasul some way to try his case in a court of law, and so the Bush administration created military tribunals in order to do this. Now, are military tribunals the same courts like you and I would go to? Clearly not. Military tribunals have operate with the military code of justice. Right? They operate using different rules. The judge, the lawyers, the jury are all military personnel. In order to get a conviction in a military tribunal, all you'll need is a simple majority vote. You do not need a unanimous vote. So it's clearly not the same courts that you and I would go into. And so the Bush administration issued these military tribunals in order to give or pacify, right, Rasul, to be able to try his case, given the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court said he should be afforded his rights. Well, fast forward 2 years, and let's talk about Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. Again, Hamdan is an alleged member of Al-Qaeda, sues former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in 2006, and this was Hamdan's argument. Wait, let's not use military tribunals, Hamdan argues. He basically says that military tribunals were never given. That power to set up military tribunals was never given to the president under the AUMF. That it was not written under the AUMF. And interestingly enough, when you look at the AUMF, there is nothing there that says military tribunals. And I can prove it to you. You can go back to Canvas, open up that document. It's not a long document, the AUMF. That authorization to use military force, and I'd challenge you to look up military tribunals. You won't find it there. And so it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and who did the court rule in favor of, Hamdan or Rumsfeld? Well, it's no surprise the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Hamdan. Mr. Hamdan, you are correct. The Bush administration has no legal authority to set up military tribunals because it was never listed down under the authorization to use military force. And so, as a result of this Supreme Court ruling, you guys, Congress responded. Congress at that time was a majority Republican Congress, so they passed what's called the Military Commissions Act of 2006. And the Military Commissions Act of 2006 did a variety of things, but I'm just going to mention two, which is important to our story. The Military Commissions Act of 2006 gave the president, right, this is Congress acting, right, gave the president the ability to set up military tribunals. Bam. It's an amendment, right, to the AUMF. Congress says, okay, all right, U.S. Supreme Court, you said we can't set up military tribunals, then we in Congress are going to empower the president to set up military tribunals. Well, the Republicans in Congress were also very outraged that, these detainees could use our legal system, our courts, to try to defend their case, and basically said, that is it. We are no longer going to allow detainees to use our courts to defend themselves. We're going to basically prevent these detainees from using our courts. No more appeals. No more appeals. Okay? And that was stipulated in the Military Commissions Act of 2006. Okay? These detainees in Guantanamo cannot use our courts to be able to defend themselves. Well, why then do we have another Supreme Court case, fast forward 2 years from 2006? In 2008, why do we have this Supreme Court case called Boumediene versus Bush? Boumediene, folks, was the alleged driver of Osama bin Laden, sues former President George W. Bush. And this is what Boumediene says. He has a problem with the Military Commissions Act, specifically that second part that I've just mentioned to you, the inability of detainees to appeal their case using our courts. Boumediene argues that this violates his habeas corpus rights. That by not trying, not using the courts, and by not being able to appeal, he does not know what he is being formally charged with or charged of. And interestingly enough, it goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 very controversial decision, the Supreme Court rules in favor of Boumediene. And think about this. Why? Well, it's actually black and white. And you already know the answer. Because if you go back again to the U.S. Constitution under Article 1, Section 9, it says there that Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And again, the Military Commissions Act was an act of Congress. And by preventing, in this case, Boumediene from appealing, clearly Congress has now violated and overstepped, right, its authority by preventing Mr. Boumediene his habeas corpus rights. Now, think about the ramifications of this Supreme Court case and why it was very contentious and why it is a 5-4 decision, you guys. The implication is fairly simple. Think about what the court just said, that we can give people like Boumediene Hamdan al-Rasool, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of 9/11, these detainees, who are not even U.S. citizens, are then allowed to be given due process rights. Think about that. Under our legal system, we're going to have to give these folks rights. Now, there's a part of me that's saying this is really unfair because there's a double standard, right? If our military, one of our soldiers were to be captured, let's say by Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or ISIS, okay, are they going to be given due process rights? The answer is pretty simple, no, right? They're not going to be given rights. They're going to be bound, and in all likelihood, they're going to be killed, right? Someone's going to behead them. Someone's going to be filming that and then posting it on YouTube the following day. So there is a double standard, right? Clearly, right, if any of our U.S. military personnel would be captured by these terrorist organizations, there's no rights. And yet the flip side of the argument to this is when we were doing this, when we were detaining these suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the world became outraged and looked at us, the United States, right? The country that was founded on liberty and freedom, that asserted that all men are created equal, that all men should be provided with due process rights, rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, natural rights, and so on and so forth. Here we were, right, in the midst of this war, locking people up and throwing away the key and not giving them rights. And so the world looked at us and said, "You hypocrites." And so you could see here, folks, that this was a major debate that happened, and clearly the question of enemy combatants here, the question of whether the administration can do this, was it legal? To a certain degree it was, and then the Supreme Court said ultimately no. And what's interesting is that certain of these detainees were tried in federal civilian courts, some were tried in military tribunals, and some were able to prove that they were not a threat to the United States. And interestingly enough, once they were released, our intelligence community have reported back to Congress that some of these people that we've detained, that we've released from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, are now plotting against us. And so it's a very delicate issue here that we're talking about, folks. And President Trump has recommitted again to sending more folks, sending again more of these individuals who are a threat to our national security to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, that remains open even today. And so let's now turn to the terrorist surveillance programs here. I know there's a lot of text here. I want you to understand that these are ultimately the programs that the government uses to try to wiretap us and collect metadata on all of us. And as you know, this is very, very controversial as well. Back shortly, in fact, after 9/11, President Bush secretly ordered the National Security Agency, or the NSA, ordered an executive order here, okay, via an executive order, to basically monitor the phone calls and other communications that originated from parties outside of the U.S. And again, I'm just reading from the slide here because I think it's pretty straightforward. With known or suspected links to Al-Qaeda, even if that origin of the communication lies within or outside of the United States. So this was a secret executive order. In a way, right, like I said, it's a national directive by the president. The general public was unaware that this was happening for a period of time. But this really allowed the NSA, right, to not just track these terrorists abroad, but also here in the United States. And it also allowed the federal government to also track, communications, emails, whatnot, at that point, from U.S. citizens. Okay? So that happened. And then, folks, following a few years ago, we know of this particular gentleman, pictured right below here, Edward Snowden, okay, who used to be a former CIA analyst, also worked for the NSA. Well, he, of course, had very high security clearance, and he decided to expose the Obama administration's use of this program called the PRISM program. And ultimately, this was a government-led program that allowed them to collect metadata on U.S. citizens from companies that we all love and adore, right? Companies including Facebook, Google, and Apple here. And so the question is, the bottom line here is, can the U.S. government do this, right? Can the U.S. government trace information to try to track again these terrorists or these suspected terrorists, or have they in fact crossed the line here and violated our constitutional rights, particularly our rights to privacy? So let's talk about it in much greater detail. So once again, the legal argument here is the same, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, right? The president is going to argue, clearly I have the ability to do this. This is part of my inherent powers. I'm doing this via executive order. Clearly, these powers were delegated to me by Congress under the AUMF. And both Bush and Obama, right, argued that, once again, they're able to do this because it's the president's role and responsibility to keep all of us safe via national security. They also point out that there's historical precedent to this. You can go all the way up to the beginning of the Republic. General Washington sent spies, okay, arrested British spies and officers to collect data on military movements and whatnot. Lincoln did it, of course, during the Civil War. In fact, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War as well, okay, and collected intelligence against the Confederacy. FDR did it during World War II, and I'm sure Woodrow Wilson also did it during World War I. So there's historical precedent that allows presidents to have done this, okay, to make sure that we're tracking the enemy and going after the enemy. The next reason I think is also very important, and it's this idea of real-time intelligence, okay? It used to be in the past that once the intelligence community tracks and discovers a potential threat, they have to stop tracing that individual to procure a search warrant. And via the FISA courts, which we'll talk much more about. That, again, is very controversial even today, right? And ultimately, once they get that search warrant, then the person that they were tracking would be long gone. Okay? And so that's a problem, right? And in today's world, with the technology that we have, it is easy for the enemy here, right, to operate under the grid. Okay? When I started teaching this 12 years ago, it was cell phones, right? You can easily discard cell phones and get new ones. You can use SIM cards and whatnot. And today, as technology has continued to evolve, the enemy is now using very, very sophisticated algorithms embedded in apps to communicate. And so clearly, the federal government, our intelligence community must be equipped to make sure that these folks are tracked and that these folks are ultimately prevented again from carrying out their terrorism acts. So, and if you understand the world today that we live in, clearly I think we're moving away from conventional war to cyber war. And so, right, given this is beyond the topic of this class, but again, the alleged Russian interference, okay, in the 2016 elections is just an example of how warfare has now, in a way, transitioned from conventional warfare to now, as I said, cyber warfare. And in fact, you guys, let me just say this, that 9/11 could have been prevented. I will tell you 9/11 could have been prevented because we knew that Al-Qaeda existed. We, in fact, knew that Osama bin Laden was plotting against us. That is true. In fact, we knew Osama bin Laden. How did we know him? Well, we trained him. We funded him. We funded the Mujahideen, folks. This was during the time when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union was, of course, our enemy. And we still, in a way, uphold upon this foreign policy where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we helped out Osama bin Laden. The CIA trained Osama bin Laden. We equipped the Mujahideen to fight effectively against the Russians, and they won. And so we knew that Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was plotting against us. In fact, the CIA was tracing them. And understand that when the 9/11 hijackers entered into the United States, that was when the CIA, because of mission creep here, decides not to trace them. And because of conflicting jurisdictions here, did not pass that sensitive information to the FBI. It's the FBI who then becomes responsible for these hijackers, but when they entered in the United States, they fell off the grid. In fact, one of them went to Minnesota, got flying lessons at Minnesota, and told his instructor, show me how to take off, maybe maneuver the plane, but we'll skip the landing part. And folks, that should have been an easy red flag, right? But it was never traced because that information was never passed to the appropriate agencies, and as a result, 9/11 happened because the intelligence community failed to share information and failed to connect the dots. In fact, in my master's thesis, I essentially tried to help provide some research to try to address that problem in the areas of interoperability. In fact, my master's thesis was used by Congresswoman Doris Matsui and was cited there to help intelligence agencies to better protect us. And so that's my little contribution to keeping our country safe. So this idea of real-time intelligence is clearly a valid argument. So let's now take a look at the illegal argument. Alright guys, let's shift gears now to the terrorist surveillance program's illegal argument. I think it's pretty obvious here that clearly when government is able to pry into our privacy, that violates our civil liberties and violates our right to privacy. And the courts have always been very serious to ensure that the government doesn't overstep its grounds. And so given that the first executive order that President George W. Bush implemented, it was pretty damning because it had no judicial oversight in the first place. The NSA was given really willy-nilly the ability to tap anyone's phone calls or look at anyone's emails. There was no judicial oversight here. There was no probable cause test, and so there was no search warrants that were issued to allow the NSA to do this. If they believed that a particular person had ties to terrorists, if they were trying to contact perhaps even family members in Pakistan, that may be enough cause for them to tap. So understand there was no arbiter here, neutral arbiter to determine whether or not there was probable cause. And so if this was legal, they would have gone through the FISA courts. Hint, hint, good matching section or multiple choice section for the exam. FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This was an act that was passed by Congress in the 70s that gave government here the ability to wiretap citizens, U.S. citizens, if there is probable cause. And so the FISA Act created these FISA courts, which are secret courts where government goes to procure these search warrants. And if there is probable cause, there's enough evidence there to show that you are a suspected terrorist or you may have committed a crime, then the government can procure a warrant to collect data from you or wiretap you and whatnot. Understand again that the first executive order did not meet this standard. However, the PRISM program that was revealed by Edward Snowden did have judicial oversight. Members of Congress did know about that program, albeit it was secret to the general public, and it did go through the FISA courts. Now, if you take a look at the changes since Snowden, there have been some policies that the Obama administration has changed, and I am not quite sure yet whether the Trump administration has changed any of these policies. But clearly the NSA is no longer to control the database where this information is collected. The NSA now needs a warrant via FISA to conduct searches on any database. It halts halts eavesdropping of foreign leaders. Again, we were spying on even our allies here, including Angela Merkel, which was not well received, of course, by the German Chancellor. And again, if government is going to review any phone calls, it has to be 2 steps removed from the number that's associated with either that terrorist organization instead of 3. So you don't necessarily need to know the changes here. I just want you to understand that there were some changes again in response to Edward Snowden. And lastly here, I failed to mention the Apple versus FBI slash government controversy. Some of you folks may remember that the San Bernardino shooters had an iPhone, and the federal government, of course, wanted to unlock the iPhone, but it was so secure, supposedly, that the federal government asked Apple to unlock the phone, and Apple refused, given the fact that they wanted to respect their customers' privacy. And so this again can be framed through the issue of technology versus national security here, and ultimately, Apple did not capitulate, but the federal government found out how to open it anyways. And in fact, I do believe this is my take on this issue, that when the federal government was asking Apple to unlock the system, they wanted to create a legal precedence that allowed them to do that. And again, Apple, of course, refused. Tim Cook refused for the federal government to do this. And again, they finally found a way to open it. And I think the government always has a way to unlock these type of devices. It's not as secure as we may think they are. But again, this falls into this debate of technology, our privacy versus, again, national security. So again, the question is, folks, is where do you draw the line, right? We live in a free society. On one hand, we want to respect privacy, and yet you also have, again, the argument here that government should have the authority here to make sure that we are protected from people, both foreign and domestic, who wants to do us harm. And so I want to turn to the next policy, set of policies here, which are called extraordinary renditions. And this is essentially, again, also approved by the president, you guys, that allows the U.S. military to basically arrest those folks or detain those folks who we suspect to be enemies of the United States, suspected terrorists, or alleged supporters of groups in which the U.S. government considers to be terrorist organizations. And what they would do is the military would capture them and then hand them off to the CIA, where they would be put in the Cessna planes and flown to countries like Egypt, countries in Eastern Europe and whatnot, and where they would be brought to these secret CIA black sites where they would be interrogated. And again, I think you know why this is controversial, because clearly when I would say interrogated here, I would put those in air quotes, because clearly what may be happening there is not just simple interrogation, but torture. And so that is very important to discuss. So let's talk about, again, the legality of extraordinary renditions. So the legal argument, again, basically it's the same thing that you've heard all along here. The president can do this because it falls within his inherent powers. Under Article 2, Section 2, he's able to issue an executive order. This was power given to him under the AUMF by Congress. And for a very for a very long period of time, you guys, for a few years, in fact, the Bush administration, shortly following 9/11, never either admitted nor did they deny that we were conducting these operations. And then finally, one day, I believe it was in 2006, President Bush had a White House press conference and revealed to the world that we were conducting these extraordinary renditions. Now, there's two reasons why he did this, or in fact, he was forced to do this. The first reason, hint, hint, is because of the CIA. Okay, the CIA is clearly not part of the Department of Defense. And how do we know this? It's because they are not protected under the protections of the Geneva Conventions, right? The CIA is civilian. They are not military. They do not wear a uniform, at least those who are, of course, that go rogue. They clearly do not officially affiliate, right, with a sovereign government. They're going to deny that if that was the case. And clearly they are very good at hiding weapons. So clearly they are not, they would not be considered POWs or legal combatants in any way. And so what had happened was there were instances where there were secret black sites in Italy, in fact. And the Italian authorities found this secret black site. They discovered this place where our CIA officers were interrogating these detainees, and of course they were arrested. But of course they also had diplomatic immunity, so they were able to go home. And ultimately, the Italian authorities concluded that they were torturing these detainees, and had the possibility too of taking these CIA agents and trying them as war criminals, which they eventually did, and they were tried in absentia. And because of this, President Bush had to intervene and let the world know that we were conducting, again, these operations. And at the end of the day, our extra legal authority as the United States here prevented these CIA officers from being tried. And so President Bush ultimately came out and told the world that we were doing these practices for the first reason to try to protect the CIA agents, again, abroad, who are conducting these operations in these black sites, and of course to protect them, folks, from being tried as war criminals or being charged with torture. Why? I think you understand this. President Bush signed a presidential signing statement that allows him to define what torture is and what torture isn't. And of course, with that legal statement, the president can give cover, right, to CIA agents to try to convince the world that what they were doing was not torture, but rather, as defined in his presidential signing statement, and again the subsequent memo, which became infamously known as the torture memos, as a legal form of torture called harsh interrogation techniques. That's been declassified. You guys can look it up. Just Google it. Harsh interrogation techniques. You will see that there were practices that we, the United States, engaged in that allowed us to define what torture is and what torture isn't, and following up upon the president's presidential signing statement and his orders to do so. And so you've probably have heard of waterboarding and how that is illegal. It's illegal and deemed illegal by the Geneva Conventions, and is considered torture under the Geneva Conventions. And if you read the torture memos, it explicitly states that it can be a harsh interrogation technique if the water that is used on detainees were not below freezing, but in room temperature, right? And so you'll see a lot of those type of policies that was written in the torture memos to describe these, right? For those of you guys who don't know, waterboarding, it is a method of torture. You've probably seen Hollywood dramatize it, where you have a detainee, a sackcloth is put over his head, he's put on a plank in a downward angle, and then the interrogator would pour water into the sackcloth, that would enter into his nostrils to simulate drowning, and it's not pleasant at all. And so, like I said, if the water was below freezing, that would be torture. Okay, you can't do that. But if it was in room temperature, that would be deemed as a harsh interrogation technique, a legal form of torture. Another example would be taking a detainee and throwing them into the wall. That would be illegal, and that would be considered a form of torture. However, if that wall was padded a little bit, okay, it would be deemed as a harsh interrogation technique. Another example would be sleep deprivation techniques that were used on detainees, where music would be blaring at a very high decibel. And if the decibel is below a certain decibel limit, that would be considered as a harsh interrogation technique, legal torture. If it's above a certain decibel, it would be illegal. Okay, and so I'm not making this up. You can read it on your own. But as you can see, this really allowed the administration here to define what torture is and what torture isn't. That goes back again to that presidential signing statement, whether or not this was actually used legally, right? So that said, let's move on to the illegal arguments for extraordinary renditions. And so when you look at the illegal argument here, clearly this violates the Geneva Convention, right? Violates human rights. It violates the national sovereignty of these governments where we had these secret black sites. Clearly violates McCain's anti-torture amendment. And so, as I said, what construes torture? And so this harsh interrogation techniques and waterboarding, as I explained in the previous slide, is brought up here. And so this was debated again during the time of the Obama and Bush administration, the Bush and Obama administrations, to do that. And so what you'll see in the next slide is some of the changes that happened when Obama ultimately became president. When President Obama took office, he ultimately, in 2009, reversed and revoked really many of the Bush administration executive orders on interrogation and detention. His goal was to try to make it legal, right? The Bush administration, in a way, took, you could argue, poetic justice here to work beyond the scope of the law. And I think you can understand why, right? To try to protect the country. And by the way, I would argue that President Bush was a success. The United States did not experience another 9/11 attack while he was president through the rest and the duration of his tenure. So it was a success. I think what Obama ultimately did was to try to circumscribe those policies within the bounds of the law, and he did that. Okay. Ultimately, renditions continued. The FBI would be in charge, along with the CIA, to make sure that it wasn't torture. The National Security Council would then provide oversight, and the use of the Army Field Manual would be used to determine the techniques that are used. And again, you're just going to have to trust the government in saying that they're doing this. Guantanamo has still yet to close, and clearly President Trump has said he would not close Guantanamo Bay. And I think I've already mentioned that 9/11 suspects were tried in federal civilian court and military tribunals. That continues to happen. Albeit, I think you'll see in the future here more people will be sent to Guantanamo Bay and will be questioned and detained there. They're still, even though they are afforded their rights, there is, again, the ability of the intelligence community, the military, to interrogate them. So if you take a look at the drone program, and this really came about during the Obama administration. I had you folks read a few articles on the legality of the drone program published by the Guardian newspaper. And this really stems from the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011, you guys, and hint hint, where ultimately this allows the government to detain anyone who they believe to be a terrorist, including here American citizens. By the way, this is still law today. So if you're a U.S. citizen but the government suspects you to be a terrorist, they can still detain you for an indefinite period of time. In fact, there was a leaked DOJ memo, Department of Justice memo, that was disclosed several years, or leaked several years ago, that found that the president could have, under his authority, extra legal authority to kill suspected terrorists, even if they are in the U.S., and even if they are U.S. citizens as well. That was ultimately brought off this caveat when this was leaked. Members of the media asked the DOJ press secretary if the president can order a killing of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, and the answer was, in fact, there was no answer given, which means the answer, the de facto answer is yes, he can. So understand that this is a very important consideration when you look at the use of drones. And so clearly, again, the president has the ability to use the drone program, and understand that President Obama has used drones a lot. And in fact, you could argue was much more successful than George W. Bush in taking out our enemies using drones. And again, the legal argument, same deal here. Inherent powers, executive order, powers delegated by Congress under the AUMF, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2011. All of these would be legal rationales to allow the president to use the drone program. Now, the Obama administration's argument, again, same deal, national security, right? I need to protect the country. Terrorists who, quote, pose an imminent threat or violent attack against the United States need to get taken out. Okay? So, very straightforward. Now, the illegal arguments, again here, it violates civil liberties, right? It targets suspected terrorists or U.S. citizens for assassination without due process. This is such an important point, you guys, because we talked about in this class something called Bill of Attainder. And I told you that the Bill of Attainder was the way for government to ultimately, detain you and slap you with this Bill of Attainder and declare your guilt. Okay? At least with the Bill of Attainder, they lock you away and they throw the key. Okay? With the drone program, understand that the president not only does he become, the judge here, but he also becomes the executioner, right? Because if the government suspects you are a terrorist, you're not going to be afforded a trial. They're not even going to arrest you. They're just going to find you, and they're going to ultimately hurl a bomb at you and kill you, right, with a Predator drone. And so clearly this becomes very controversial, because this violates the due process rights of these suspected terrorists. You could argue it violates the rule of law. There's no court oversight. There's no transparency or accountability, and clearly this violates checks and balances too. So a very serious consideration here with the use of the drone program.